시간 관계상 두 번째 발표 시작하겠습니다.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Jan Maynard Nualla. I'm a segment producer for GMA News. It's one of the broadcast media organizations in the Philippines. And I'm also here as a representative of the Asian Center for Journalism. I'm a fellow of the Ateneo de Manila University. I'm sharing here our discussions in one of our subjects as an MA journalism student in the Asian Center for Journalism. There we discussed about Asian journalism and the flow of news here. Our question in mind here in this session is that does the world truly hear the voice of Asia? Actually, the topic for this session is more on ASEAN, but I would like to raise Asia as a continent in whole because ASEAN is just 10 member countries. There is West Asia, there's South Asia, we have East Asia. So if we look at it in general, the world continues to rely on the mainstream West global media for most of the news about Asia. So if we look, there are the three biggest wire agencies, the Associated Press and Reuters, who are both based in New York, and the Agence France Presse, who is based in Paris. And aside from that, if we look into the cable news networks, we have there the CNN and the BBC. And we have just started to have a voice through Al Jazeera English channel and Channel News Asia, which are based in Singapore for Channel News Asia and Qatar in Al Jazeera English. And we also have the Asian News Network in Thailand, a union of newspapers in Asia that are consolidating their news. So if we look into it, we're still basing most of our reports. This is ironic because in the Philippines, when we report about China, when we report about Malaysia, we still base our reports from Associated Press, from their reports, instead of basing from direct to that country, which is just our neighbor. What happens now is that there is this Western bias being integrated into the reports of these wire agencies. Let's say, for example, the South China Sea dispute. I remember an Associated Press report where there was a paragraph mentioning the US aid giving support to this country for doing research on this and that. So you can see that they're trying to, in some ways, they are trying to, I have to be careful with the term, but if I may be able to say it, they are trying to demonize certain Asian countries. And in effect, it's affecting the overall cooperation of in the region. Although in local and national media, we have varying degrees of political, economic, and social constraints. Political, the governments, we have different types of governments. We are a diverse continent, but you can see there's a monarchy, there's a democracy, there's a communist. So this is one of our constraints. And then we also have the economic. We are divided into developed and least developed, our developing countries. And we also have the first and foremost barriers, which is the language, the traditions, and our religions. These are affecting the overall cooperation in our region. So one foundation, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation, is saying that compared to other continents, our region is lacking in standards and implemented legislation that ensure the freedom of expression, self-regulation of the press, and protection of the journalists. If we looked into international rankings, many Asian countries are on top in terms of problems in media freedom, and impunity always is still a culture in many Asian journalists. Another is the Southeast Asian Press Alliance. If we look into their 2013 report, they noted that Southeast Asia in particular has moved backward in media freedom, with more restrictive laws being enacted, if not maintained by such governments as Brunei, Laos, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Singapore. Although we have members here from those countries, maybe you can shed light into these issues. And then in many countries in our region, journalists and civil society continue to be threatened by violence, as already raised earlier by Professor Danny Haraw. So the problem is that unlike our Western counterparts, many Asian countries still uphold the interests of the state over the people's freedom of expression. Media are still being viewed not as watchdogs, but rather as mere instruments in protecting government ideologies or social structures. So in the end, this has resulted in a widespread practice of self-censorship among mainstream media organizations in order to sustain their existence in these countries. So the flow of news is affected by violence, which stems to restrictive laws, but also from government and private efforts to cover up certain issues. And another instance is in Indonesia and in the Philippines, where media are relatively freer. New laws and regulations threaten to interfere with our work. So we are now under a greater risk of criminal defamation or restrictions in covering public interest information. And also in Timor-Leste, a draft media law is promoting regulation instead of freedom of the media. Whereas in Laos, where Thailand and Vietnam are among the top investors, land disputes often arise from their ventures or projects. These are some of the problems that we see, although there are some positive developments, such as in Myanmar. Most of us may know that the parliament has finally dissolved the country's Press Scrutiny and Registration Division, which has for several years overseen the content regulation of news under the military regime, which was why for several decades they only have weeklies because their newspapers have to undergo several screening from the government before they are being published. So because of the dissolution of this division, finally there are now 4 new daily newspapers in Myanmar. So it has certainly improved from the days when long pre-publication censorship procedures had forced the press to produce only weeklies. So, although there is still post-publication censorship, democratic reforms under the new nominally civilian Burmese government are a welcome move. So how do we now balance the flow of Asian news in the world? 2 main points I'd like to raise is improved press freedom in Asia. Because of course, no matter how we try to do it in our own work environments, if there's still restrictions in our governments, we cannot do our full potential in raising many of the points of or the issues in our region. And this was one question in our course discussions in school. Is it possible to have a globally recognized Asian news agency instead of these wire services that we continue to subscribe to? Because if there's an Asian news agency, there's a great potential for us to have our true and genuine voice to the world. And they can really see the culture, the differences, the diversity, and our side. Because the world still sees Asia through the eyes of Western journalists. I don't know what can be done to create this kind of agency, although now we have these Al Jazeera, we have these Channel News Asia who are giving hope to such a feat. So I think in this session we can discuss what ways we can that we can do to have this real Asian voice. In 2009, there was a media forum in ASEAN, and I noted some of their recommendations, which I think are also good to look into for possible collaborations for this Asian news agency and other possible ways to have a true Asian news flow in the world. So first, we have these collaborations between Asian broadcast networks. In our country, I think we have done some, although this is not news, these are drama series that are collaborations between big networks in the Philippines or in collaboration with Malaysia and Vietnam and the Philippines. So these are possible strategies that we can look into and can apply in the journalism industry. If you heard about the offshore series of journalists in the world that they collaborated to look into the offshore accounts of politicians across many countries in the world. That's also a possible strategy for us in the Asian region. We actually did that in one of our course subjects in the Asian Center for Journalism. It's called cross-border reporting, where we tried to team up with another journalist from another Asian country. And we tried to look for a story that are both affecting the two countries. Although in that assignment, I wasn't with another Asian journalist. I was with a fellow Filipino journalist who is in a local area. My other classmates were able to do those cross-border reporting stories where it helped in giving further understanding between the two nations. And we can do this in our own workplaces. This forum is an opportunity for us to collaborate with each other. Maybe there is a possibility that I can do, or we can do stories with each other in our countries, in Thailand, in Vietnam, in Myanmar. So that's one. So another recommendation in the ASEAN Media Forum was that there needs to be a development of curriculums in our countries to include Asian history in our journalism, communication, and basic education courses, so as to give further understanding to our citizens and our future journalists of how important it is to have an Asian voice in the global media. Another here is that an exchange program or forum for Asian students. I think this is already happening in some parts of the region. Like for in our case in the Philippines, we have this Asian Center for Journalism, where we have a fellowship for a certain number of journalists every year. I actually have here some of my classmates, Mr. Buwan Casey from Nepal and Mr. Yu Fang from China. So this it's a great opportunity for us to do stories, to collaborate with each other, to learn from the structures of our media environments in each country, so that we can apply what is happening in their country to our country and foster further development and improvement of what lacks. But still, going back to the political and social, cultural, and economic constraints, we need to advocate for, as journalists, we need to advocate for further press freedom in our region. So that's all. Thank you very much.
예, 우선 발표 잘 들었습니다. 첫 번째 발표하신 왕wenwen 씨는 사실은 차이나에 있는 이제 글로벌 타임즈가 현재까지는 서방의 시선에서 봤을 때는 정부 기관인지 공산